This is Radio Ukraine International with the weekly program Doing Business, hosted by Rodion Zhiznievsky and produced by Konstantin Lavrentyuk. Doing Business covers current economic developments in and concerning Ukraine and gives topical information as well as immediate and longer-term economic forecasts. It is what we think might give you food for thought and help you see Ukraine through the economic angle. Over the past 15 years, all countries without exception have been affected by crisis. Targeted by hybrid attacks, the United States and European democracies, including Ukraine, have long been in search of effective responses to security challenges. Such responses were discussed at an international conference dubbed Democracy in Action that recently took place in Kyiv. The topic was hybrid threats to democracy, misinformation, legal wars, and corruption. Participants discussed ways to effectively respond to human rights violations and strategic corruption. One of them is well-known Global Magnitsky Act. Once adopted in the United States to other countries across the world, it has become a powerful tool of the West to punish abusers of human rights and people engaged in corruption. Currently, the United States has one of the most comprehensive and strong mechanisms of personal sanctions and visa bans. It was used earlier this year against Ukrainian oligarch Igor Kolomoisky. In this regard, participants in the Kyiv conference dwell on how the European Union could best use this instrument of personal sanctions to punish violators of human rights and fight corruption. The program of the conference included speeches by such remarkable figures as Philip Ricker, U.S. Acting Assistant Secretary of State for European and Euro-Asian Affairs, Jerzy Pomanovsky, Executive Director of the European Endowment for Democracy, Jamie Fly, President and CEO of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Oliver Bullock, the author of the book Moneyland. The headliners were Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Moldovan President Maya Sandu, Latvian Prime Minister Krišjānis Kariņš, Vera Jourova, Vice President of the European Commission for Values and Transparency, and Mircea Juhani, NATO Deputy Secretary General. We were lucky to interview Девід Стулік, an authoritative Czech expert, Антті Юхані Хартікайнен, head of the EU Advisory Mission to Ukraine, and Katarína Mathernova, Deputy Director General for Neighborhood and Enlargement of the European Commission. I asked them to point out their main position statements. Could you tell me, please, about the main points of your speech?
I'm going to raise the issue of Russian disinformation narratives that are related to the Czech Republic and to the latest story about the explosions of the ammunition depots in the Czech Republic. And I'm also going to say kind of a positive thing, pass a positive message that these narratives do not work anymore. So that's a good thing that in that so-called information war we are able to also kind of strike victories. So I will just describe the way how these narratives have been spread by pro-Russian proxies, political parties or political representatives. And I would then also use the public opinion polls proving that these alternative narratives, disinformation narratives, didn't influence the public opinion, which is a good thing.
Said Девід Стулік.
What was interesting, I think, for the public to hear is that the three countries, Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova, are important partners of the European Union, and they exist in a very difficult set of circumstances because they have a lot of internal challenges and demands the old system fighting the new, having vested interest, still trying to prevent reforms. And they have a lot of reform challenges ahead and the need to continue reforms for the benefit of the citizens. And at the same time, they face external challenges. One, obviously, is the role of Russia. I mean, in Georgia and Moldova, there are frozen conflicts. In Ukraine, there is an active conflict in the east, an occupied important part of the country. And at the same time, the geopolitical developments in the world are such that it's very difficult to keep the international attention on this part of the world. So I think that the task and the challenges are real. And what I was trying to say is that the European Union is here to support and push and help, but ultimately the choices will be made by both the political elites and the civil societies in these three countries.
That was said by Katarina Mathernova, Deputy Director General for Neighborhood and Enlargement of the European Commission. Could you please say the main points of your speech that you had just a few minutes ago?
Yeah, that first of all I introduced our mission, our mandate very briefly, that we are supporting this further development of Ukrainian civilian security sector. And then I also explained these recent positive developments, this draft law on security service, then attestation of prosecutors, customs officers, some positive anti-corruption activities in the national police, and so on.
Said Antті Juhani, head of the EU advisory mission to Ukraine. You're listening to Radio Ukraine's weekly program, Doing Business. How does corruption affect the economy and politics?
Well, in the Czech Republic, we have a big issue with the conflicts of interest of a prime minister, who is, according to the European Commission, abusing his position as one of those who decide, for example, on the use of the public funds for commercial companies. So he is at the same time benefiting, as the owner of many companies, he's benefiting from these European funds, which at the same time he is programming, he is kind of designing, co-designing together with the other European politicians. So he is actually abusing his position, so he has obvious conflicts of interest. It's not a corruption per se, but it's another kind of a very negative effect how the European politicians or political leaders can misuse the public offices. So in that regard, it is rather a negative kind of a phenomenon, because the people, the voters, do see it, and I think that that would be one of the reasons why he might not strike well in the next parliamentary elections. And it is also kind of distorting the political life in the whole country, because the other opponents, opposition leaders, they don't have these opportunities like he has. So he is gaining some undeserved advantage. His companies are getting extra funds, state subsidies or EU subsidies. So this is something that is very negative. And the corruption element might be there in that way that he is trying to control to a certain degree law enforcement agencies, the police. His advocates, his lawyers, are trying to influence the criminal investigations in these cases. Again, there is no clear-cut corruption, but again, it's a kind of a misuse of the public offices. So he is creating a pressure on the public prosecutors, he's creating a pressure on police officers who are investigating these things. And again, the people do see it, and they see that there are different standards and a different treatment of those VIPs, politicians, and the average citizens. So again, for the democratic development, it's something negative.
Well, look, one of the panelists was saying that corruption is obviously an economic and a political challenge, but it's also a security challenge.
Right.
And corruption does affect all walks of life. But what I would like to very much say that corruption is not a phenomenon that is reserved or it's monopolized by Eastern Europe. Right. I mean, corruption is a phenomenon that at various stages of development occurs everywhere. And what one needs to do is, in my view, 3 or 4 things. One is to bring transparency into public dealings, and introduce competition in different sectors to eliminate, to limit the space where corruption can occur. And the third thing is then, and this is unfortunately something that takes longer time, and that is build institutions that help protect justice and transparency in the civic and economic life. But that takes time. That's sometimes a generational change, and that's why, in my experience, it's faster and more effective to address corruption before it occurs, right? So to bring competition into different sectors of economy, so people who have privileged access to information or resources can't capture the space. And I think that certainly Ukraine has done important strides in this respect. I used an example, for example, of the time when the National Bank of Ukraine let the hryvnia float, which in fact meant that all the money that was made by manipulating the fixed exchange rate suddenly disappeared. That opportunity for corruption. So if you introduce competition and if you introduce rules that apply to everybody into different sectors of the economy, that's how you can limit the space where corruption can occur.
Yeah, economy it affects in many ways that you know that for example it has been already mentioned in this forum many times that for example, when we are talking about foreign investments, it's very difficult for foreign companies to come here and invest if you are corrupted. And that's one of the biggest challenges. And I would take this issue mostly from the economic point of view, but also then this equal treatment of the people. That's also extremely important, that if you can avoid all the punishment just by providing some bribes, that's also extremely unfair.
That's true. What threats does corruption pose to democracy?
It's very much the same that, for example, parliament. What has been now a little bit this challenge that these oligarchs are having kind of much influence to these parliamentarians, and that's of course also difficult situation because they are like trying to drive their private interests and not interests of Ukrainians.
And the next my question is going to be about the relationship between our countries. So how do our countries interact in the fight against corruption?
Well, we know that quite many Ukrainian citizens, including some political figures, have their property in the Czech Republic. They have invested in real estate or in some other assets there. And how we can cooperate? I mean, there is an agreement at the governmental level on the exchange of information, for example. So we know that our, let's say, prosecutors' offices cooperate with each other. For example, big case was with Mr. Martynenko, the former MP, who was accused of corruption in the case of supplying nuclear fuel to Ukrainian nuclear power stations, and he was using Czech companies. So the Czech prosecutors were interrogating some witnesses in the Czech Republic, and all that evidence was then passed to NABU, for example, or to I think that also that evidence was used by the Ukrainian Supreme Anti-Corruption Court, or Specialized Anti-Corruption Court. So this is the classical way of exchanging information, sharing intelligence information, and then helping each other with, for example, interrogating the witnesses.
Said Девід Stulік, a Czech expert.
There has been some discussion on police cooperation, customs cooperation, border guard cooperation, but not really related that much to corruption. And we need to remember that when Finland is part of the EU, that support is actually coming via EU more. And then, for example, regarding border management, there is this EU Border and Coast Guard Agency, and they try to support also Ukraine State Border Guard Service.
Said Antті Juhani, head of the EU advisory mission to Ukraine. You're listening to Radio Ukraine's weekly program, Doing Business. How was corruption overcome in your country?
Well, I used the example of the banking sector. Before we reformed and recapitalized and privatized the banks, you used to get loans by bribing the bank officials. And once these companies, these banks were put on a solid footing, suddenly there was no option of bribing and no necessity anymore, because the banks were in the business of lending and they had their procedures and they were followed. So that's a very concrete example through which I lived myself.
That was said by Katarina Maternova, Deputy Director General for Neighborhood and Enlargement of the European Commission. How was it overcome in your country?
I'm from Finland, and that's interesting because we have been all the time on the top of these rankings, that the less corrupted country in the world. I'm completely stupid in corruption because this. We have, of course, some corruption cases, but it's very different. That it's not like a large-scale corruption. Of course, people sometimes they make mistakes. But for example, this security service reform, we made it. Also in Finland, a big reform. It took years to reform that. Nowadays it's called Security Intelligence Agency. Normal like a governmental process with the parliament, how it was implemented, and there was meanwhile a lot of different opinions, but we managed to find that like a compromise that how to go ahead. But our agency, they actually got some more powers, authorization to get info than what they had in the past.
So basically you said that there is no such problem for Finland, but how can you assess the prospects for Ukraine? Like how many years do we need to reach that level that Finland has?
That could be very difficult to estimate, but...
just approximately.
But that it will surely. I think that you need like a new generation, because many practices people they have learned some practices and very difficult to get rid of them. Back home, but we as a child already we learned that this is the way how to work. That for example, that if you would in Finland try to bribe a police officer, it would be a big mistake that it will never fly. Or customs officer or this kind of, don't even try it. It doesn't make any sense because you will just face a big problem after that.
Yeah,
that's
get even more problems, I guess. Right.
Yeah.
How can you assess the prospects of Ukraine like in this direction? Do we make any progress in fighting against corruption?
I think that the progress is extremely slow, and it's a very disappointing thing, not only for Ukrainians, but also for all the friends of Ukraine in Europe or globally. Because if there is enough of political will to fight with this systemic corruption, then it would serve the interests of both the Ukrainian public, Ukrainian citizens, as well as the Western democracies. Because Ukraine would become one of the, let's say, standard European countries with functioning free market economy, with functioning state bureaucracy. The business conditions here would be almost the same as in the EU because of the association agreement with the EU. And this would give a big boost to investments in Ukraine and big boost to the economy, which the citizens would benefit from, or the Western European investors would benefit from. So the issue of corruption that is being addressed in such a slow way is detrimental to all of us, except of those who benefit from that corruption.
Said Девід Стулік. You're listening to Radio Ukraine's weekly program, Doing Business. What should be done first to fight against this corruption? What are the main steps?
Very often, actually, this legislation is extremely important. And then when we are talking about the civilian security sector reform, that I do not want to blame that the security service would be more corrupted than any other law enforcement agency, but somehow I feel that these reforms, they should be like started from there. I see that these other reforms of law enforcement agencies, it's very difficult to make them successful without reforming security service.
Said Антті Juhani, head of the EU advisory mission to Ukraine.
One of the first things is to have proper law enforcement agencies, and here there are some, let's say, I would say, achievements already in place, like the establishment of the respective institutions like the NABU or the Specialized Anti-Corruption Court. What needs to be done right now, I think it's the matter of further going in depth with the judicial reform, so that all courts in Ukraine, all the judges in Ukraine are flawless, that they don't have any, let's say, negative reputation, that they are indeed doing their verdicts and the court rulings are done in the sake of justice, not just for the benefit of concrete, let's say, officials, people, politicians, businessmen who can buy these court rulings. And this is also extremely important for the citizens, because then they would see that the law is, they are all equal in front of the law, in front of the court. And this is something that I would say of utmost priority for Ukraine, this judicial reform. But of course it takes time. You can't just fire dozens of thousands of judges and replace them with ready-made thousands of new judges. No, it's not possible. So you need to have a more, let's say, midterm strategy how to do these reforms of justice. And that's a huge challenge, because there are also very deep vested interests and quite a lot of interactions between the judges, political figures, economic figures, and it's just like breaking, the whole kind of a skeleton of this systemic corruption.
What threats does corruption pose to democracy?
I think that if we are talking about full democracy, it's not possible if there is corruption, at least higher level corruption, that we can say that democracy is not properly existing. It's like a fake democracy. That it's a big threat.
We cannot combine them. That's for sure.
Yeah.
That's for sure. How can you assess the level of trust in our courts, and how can you characterize them, describe them in comparison with yours?
Back home, I think that we trust on those courts very much. That it's very okay. We can sometimes criticize their decisions. But we have no even idea that we never think that way, that there would be like corruption included in the decision making. That's the difference. That in Ukraine, I think that the first issue is that they are corrupted. Yeah. But in Finland, it would be that but why they justify their decision with and this kind of things. And that could be critics, but not that they would be corrupted. Mm-hmm. Their thinking could be like a criticized.
Summing up the conference, Darya Kaleniuk, executive director of the Anti-Corruption Center, said that the pressure of civil society on government is necessary to fight corruption and oligarchic influence and maintain fair living conditions. She spoke for promoting positive reforms in Ukraine, including judicial reform. Our initiative is to invite the authorities to a constructive dialogue, she said. That was Radio Ukraine's weekly program Doing Business,